Data's Demon by Stephen Wright, Part 2. In that respect, the emergence today of numerous practices using data as their material may be understood as a return of the repressed. In the early years of the 20th century, avant-garde art practice chose to leave the realm of data compiling and information display to science alone, thereby consummating a split between those two realms of symbolic activity for almost a century. To calculate mass slaughter of World War I, the advent of the Fordist organization of production, which followed in the 1920s, merely underscored radical art's break from the murderous rationality of cost-benefit analysis, which data seemed to be too willing to serve uncritically. Art sided with the precariousness of bare life, seeking, as Georges Bataille once devastatingly put it, to break the chain of effective action. Yet the mere fact that history unfolded in that way does not foreclose art history's unrealized potential. Things could possibly have happened differently, and indeed almost did. Before resolving to define itself as the other of reason, art wavered and came close to pursuing a common path with science. Marcel Duchamp, undeniably the most important artist of the past 100 years, if not indeed the only one, often acknowledged his fascination with the way contemporary science was making use of data. Meteorological instruments, including barometers and hygrometers, and measurement gauges of all kinds, were examples of the appareils, enregistreurs, or recording devices whose indexical activities so fascinated Duchamp. His large glass, the masterpiece he worked on between 1915 and 1923, as well as his other works of the period, which were to put painting once again in the service of the mind, as he said, can only be fathomed with reference to the multitude of notes and data which he carefully amassed. Somewhat like a Sears Roebuck catalog, as he put it, the sum of information was to accompany the glass and to be quite as important as the visual material. According to André Breton, in his essay on the large glass, in this work it is impossible not to see at least the trophy of a fabulous hunt through virgin territory, at the frontiers, of the most recent data of science. Duchamp was convinced that this recent data of science offered a new lease on life for the creative intellect, and would allow him to pursue both the previously invisible sphere revealed by X-rays and to exploit the impalpable realm of electromagnetic waves. Indeed, Duchamp famously described his work at the time as an attempt to make a painting of frequency. In the scientific language of the day, the notion of réseaux or networks, referring to both electromagnetism, electricity, and the cerebral mechanisms of the brain, was very current. Duchamp picked up the term for his 1914 painting, Réseau des stoppages, or network of stoppages. The work's composition resembles a network of railway lines or electrical conduits, making Duchamp's precise diagrammatic image a clear forerunner of the sort of data-rich graphic mapping projects which would only emerge in the 1990s in the work of Marc Lombardi and others. From a formal perspective, it is tempting to see the webs of paint on Jackson Pollock's canvases as a way of mapping the internal meanderings of the psyche, though it is of course more akin to the anti-data than knowledge arranging in any conventional sense. A generation later, Marc Lombardi would do the same thing, but he was doing it with the existing economic structure, articulating visually what remained otherwise invisible, even, and perhaps particularly for those caught up in its folds. This veritable paradigm shift involved overcoming the modernist mindset that persistently opposed art and research, inasmuch as his work grappled with this tension, which it embodies in its form. Lombardi is something of an emblematic figure in the emergence of contemporary data-driven art. Lombardi's dense, and yet ethereal webs of lines and curves that plot the network of transactions and spheres of influence and conspiracy of globalized capitalism provide an indispensable link between 1970s conceptualism and the politically acute works of a younger generation of artists. Yet they do so less in terms of their content than in their terms of their discursive form. After all, as Rabbi Morahet has exemplified, vastly more information than we commonly suppose exists freely in the public sphere for anyone maniacal enough to spend their days and nights sifting through it and ordering it. And they do so in two respects. Firstly, because the drawings imply in their very nature the concept of potential extension. The ideas teased out by the artist and the space of the work remain open-ended, inviting users to pursue their vectors and links to draw their own conclusions. And secondly, because the sense of bewilderment they instill in the viewer quickly turns into a desire to know more, to go further. In compiling his visual archives, Lombardi very likely saw himself less as a sleuth than as an architect of knowledge. For data never constitutes an enumeration of mere facts, if only because the act of cataloging is itself a means of redirecting, constraining, and reshaping information. Consider Michel Foucault's classical statement in his Archaeology of Knowledge on the creative role that archives assume in the creation of knowledge. The archive determines that all things said do not accumulate endlessly in an amorphous mass, nor are they inscribed in an unbroken linearity, nor do they disappear at the mercy of chance external accidents, but they are grouped together in distinct figures, composed in accordance with multiple relations, maintained or blurred in accordance with specific regularities. Of course, data aesthetics is not merely ordering and reordering data, but is equally about disorganizing it and drawing attention to the painful disorientation of having subjective experience objectified into data form, and their incisive dialectic of enlightenment. Adorno and Horkheimer make this point at the highest philosophical level, stigmatizing reason's capitulation before positivism. Whereas the Enlightenment construed reason as inherently corrosive of myth, they showed to what extent it had become a mere tool of calculation, of planning and coordination, neutral in regards to ends. Thinking, they argued, objectifies itself to become an automatic, self-activating process, an impersonation of the machine that it produces itself so that ultimately the machine can replace it. The conversion of enlightenment into positivism, the myth of things as they actually are, and finally the identification of the intellect and that which is inimical to the spirit, has been overwhelmingly confirmed. Our conception of history does not presume any dispensation from it, nor does it imply a positivistic search for information. It is a critique of philosophy and therefore refuses to abandon philosophy. An analogous case could be made for the growing number of socially critical artists integrating data use into their artistic practices. Their critique of data refuses to abandon data use of their adversaries alone. Adorno and Horkheimer's argument perhaps inadvertently allows us to observe an interesting philosophical duality with regard to data use. On the one hand, it has what philosophers of language term an enunciative dimension. It is an objectifying description of some state of affairs. But on the other hand, and more counterintuitively, data has a performative dimension. It makes things happen, bringing about a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy through its very self-evidence. Take a classic political example, the logic of which has repeated itself countless times in the history of biopolitics, which is the British colonization of India. baffled by the sheer heterogeneity of the Indian multitudes that they were set on dominating. The colonial rulers needed a representation, a quantified picture of absolute otherness, and if they were to government. So they organized a census asking people to identify themselves on the basis of their ethnic and religious belonging, that is, to staticize themselves according to criteria with which they had previously never identified and which distinguished them from their next-door neighbors. The facts thereby produced spoke for themselves, as such data is wont to do, and a direct line can be drawn between this data-gathering initiative and the 1948 partitioning of the territory along ethnic lines on the basis of the very data it had brought into the imaginary. The Artist Collective Bureau d'Etudes has been doing cutting-edge work over the past few years in the emergent regime of real information power, developing graphic techniques to map out sites of its application. The group's perspective is that data display is to contemporary regimes of biopower what the portrait of Louis XIV was to the monarchy. They argue that the rise of information maps are inseparable from the consolidation of biopolitical control over life systems, yet their own cognitive mapping practice itself holds out the possibility of a politically subversive use of data, not merely by providing a representation of power and counterpower, but by making that representation available for those whose life experience allows for them to make use of the information in an autonomizing framework. This underscores a fundamental difference between the beautifully hand-drawn maps of Mark Lombardi and their batch-printed flowcharts in information journals, intended less to be viewed as art within the performative framework of the art world than to reach out to a broader range of users beyond the confines of the sphere of art. Among the most forward-looking practices today make use of the socially critical potential of data as an artistic material. Yet it is obvious that the aesthetic use of data of data to court is an eminently ambivalent phenomenon. For better or worse, data makes things happen. But which is it, for better or for worse? Implicitly, that was already the question confronting the folks in Pynchon's extraordinary novel as they sat back, awaiting the crying of Lot 49.